Chapter 21. The massacre at Porta della Ginestra shocked all of Italy. Newspapers screamed in glaring headlines the slaughter of innocent men, women, and children. There were 15 dead and over 50 wounded. At first there was speculation that the mafia had committed the massacre, and indeed Silvio Ferra gave speeches laying the deed at the feet of Don Croce. But the Don had prepared for this. Secret members of the Friends of the Friends swore before magistrates that they had seen Passatempo and Terranova set their ambush. The people of Sicily wondered why Giuliano did not deny this outrageous charge in one of his famous letters to the newspapers. He was uncharacteristically silent. 2 weeks before the national election, Silvio Ferra rode on his bicycle from San Giuseppe Giotto to the town of Piani dei Greci. He cycled along the river Giotto and skirted the base of the mountain. On the road he passed 2 men who shouted at him to stop, but he cycled on swiftly. Looking back, he saw the 2 men trudging after patiently, but he soon outdistanced them and left them far behind. By the time he entered the village of Piani dei Greci, they were no longer in sight. Ferra spent the next 3 hours in the socialist community house with other party leaders from the surrounding area. When they were done, it was twilight, and he was anxious to get home before dark. He walked his bicycle through the central square, greeting cheerily some of the villagers he knew. Suddenly 4 men surrounded him. Silvio Ferra recognized one of them as the mafia chief of Montelepre, and he felt a sense of relief. He had known Quintana as a child, and Ferra also knew that the mafia was very careful in this corner of Sicily not to irritate Giuliano or break his rules about insults to the poor. And so he greeted Quintana with a smile and said, "You're a long way from home." Quintana said, "Hello, my friend. We'll walk along with you for a bit. Don't make a fuss and you won't be hurt. We just want to reason with you." "Reason with me," Silvio Ferra said. He felt the first thrill of fear, the same fear that he felt on the battlegrounds of war, a fear he knew he could master. And so now he restrained himself from doing something foolish. 2 of the men arranged themselves alongside him and gripped his arms. They propelled him gently across the square. The bicycle rolled free, then toppled over on its side. Ferra saw the people of the village sitting outside their homes become aware of what was happening. Surely they would come to his aid. But the massacre at the Porta della Ginestra, the general reign of terror, had broken their spirits. Not one of them raised an outcry. Silvio Ferra dug his heels into the ground and tried to turn back to the community house. Even this far away he could see some of his fellow party workers framed in the doorway. Couldn't they see he was in trouble? But nobody left the frame of light. He called out, "Help me!" There was no movement in the village, and Silvio Ferra felt a deep sense of shame for them. Quintana pushed him forward roughly. "Don't be a fool," he said. "We only want to talk. Now come with us without making an uproar. Don't get your friends hurt." It was almost dark. The moon was already up. He felt a gun being jabbed into his back, and he knew they would kill him in the square if they really meant to kill him. And then they would kill any friends who decided to help. He started walking with Quintana to the end of the village. There was a chance they did not mean to kill him. There were too many witnesses, and some had surely recognized Quintana. If he struggled now, they might panic and fire their guns. Better to wait and listen. Quintana was speaking to him in a reasonable voice. "We want to persuade you to stop all your communist foolishness. We have forgiven your attack of the Friends of the Friends when you accused them of the Ginestra affair. But our patience was not rewarded and it grows short. Do you think it's wise? If you continue, you will force us to leave your children without a father." By this time they were out of the village and starting up a rocky path that would lead finally to Monte Cometa. Silvio Ferra looked back despairingly but saw no one following. He said to Quintana, "Would you kill the father of a family over a small thing like politics?" Quintana laughed harshly. "I've killed men over spitting on my shoe," he said. The men holding his arms disengaged themselves, and at that moment Silvio Ferra knew his fate. He whirled and started to run down the rocky moonlit path. The villagers heard the gunfire, and one of the Socialist Party leaders went to the Carabinieri. The next morning Silvio Ferra's body was found thrown into a mountain crevice. When the police questioned villagers, nobody admitted to seeing what had happened. Nobody mentioned the 4 men. Nobody admitted to having recognized Guido Quintana. Rebellious as they might be, they were Sicilians and would not break the law of Omerta. But some told what they had seen to one of Giuliano's band. Many things combined to win the elections for the Christian Democrats. Don Croce and the Friends of the Friends had done their work well. The massacre at the Portella della Ginestra had shocked all of Italy. But it had done more than that to Sicilians. It had traumatized them. The Catholic Church, electioneering under the banner of Christ, had been more careful with its charity. The murder of Silvio Ferra was the finishing blow. The Christian Democratic Party won an overwhelming victory in Sicily in 1948, and that helped carry all of Italy. It was clear that they were to rule long in the foreseeable future. Don Croce was the master of Sicily. The Catholic Church would be the national religion, and the odds were good that Minister Trezza, not for some years but also not too late, would someday be the premier of Italy. In the end, Pisciotta was proved right. Don Croce sent word through Hector Adonis that the Christian Democratic Party could not get the amnesty for Giuliano and his men because of the massacre at the Portella della Ginestra. It would be too much of a scandal. The charges that it had been politically inspired would flare up again. The newspapers would go berserk, and there would be violent strikes all over Italy. Don Croce said that naturally Minister Trezza's hands were tied, that the Cardinal of Palermo could no longer help a man who was thought to have massacred innocent women and children, but that he, Don Croce, would continue to work for amnesty. However, he advised Giuliano that it would be better to emigrate to Brazil or the United States, and in that endeavor, he, Don Croce, would help in any way. Giuliano's men were astonished that he showed no emotion at this betrayal, that he seemed to accept it as a matter of course. He took his men further into the mountains and told his chiefs to make their camps near his own so he could assemble them all at a moment's notice. As the days passed, he seemed to retire more and more deeply into his own private world. Weeks went by as his chiefs waited impatiently for his orders. One morning he wandered deep into the mountains by himself without bodyguards. He returned in darkness and stood in the light of the campfires. "Spanu," he said, "summon all the chiefs." Prince Alorto had an estate of hundreds of thousands of acres on which he grew everything that had made Sicily the breadbasket of Italy for 1,000 years. Lemons and oranges, grains, bamboo, olive trees, which provided wells of oil, grapes for wine, oceans of tomato, green peppers, eggplants of the most royal purple as big as a carter's head. Part of this land was leased to the peasants on a 50-50 basis. But Prince Alorto, like most landowners, would skim off the top, fees for machinery used, seed supplied, and transportation provided, all with interest. The peasant was fortunate to keep 25% of the treasures he had grown with the sweat of his brow. And yet he was well off compared with those who had to hire themselves out on a daily basis and accept starvation wages. The land was rich, but unfortunately the nobles kept a good portion of their estates uncultivated and going to waste. As long ago as 1860, the great Garibaldi had promised the peasants they would own their own land. Yet even now Prince Alorto had 100,000 acres that lay fallow. So did the other nobles who used their land as a cash reserve, selling off pieces to indulge their follies. In the last election, all the parties, including the Christian Democratic Party, had promised to strengthen and enforce the sharing of land laws. These laws stated that the uncultivated land of large estates could be claimed by peasant farmers on payment of a nominal sum. But these laws had always been thwarted by the nobility's practice of hiring mafia chiefs to intimidate would-be claimers of land. On the day of the claiming of lands, the mafia chief had only to ride his horse up and down the borders of the estate, and no peasant would dare to make a claim. The few who chose to do so would invariably be marked down for assassination, and the male members of his family with him. This had gone on for a century, and every Sicilian knew the rule. If the estate had a mafia chief as its protector, no lands would be claimed from it. Rome could pass 100 laws. Those laws had no significance. As Don Croce once put it to Minister Trezza in an unguarded moment, "What do your laws have to do with us?" Shortly after the election, the day came when Prince Allorto's lands could not be claimed for those parts of his estate that had not been cultivated. All 100,000 acres had been designated by the government, tongue-in-cheek. Left-wing party leaders urged the people on to make their claims. When the day arrived, almost 5,000 peasants congregated outside the gate of Prince Allorto's palace. Government officials waited in a huge tent on the property furnished with tables and chairs and other official apparatus to formally register their claims. Some of the peasants were from the town of Montelepre. Prince Allorto, following the advice of Don Croce, had hired 6 mafia chiefs as his gabilotti. And so on that bright morning, the smoky Sicilian sun making them sweat, the 6 mafia chiefs rode their horses up and down along the wall surrounding Prince Allorto's estate. The assembled peasants, under olive trees older than Christ, watched these 6 men, famous all over Sicily for their ferocity. They waited as if hoping for some miracle, too fearful to move forward. But that miracle would not be the forces of law. Minister Trezza had sent direct orders to the Marsialo commanding them that carabinieri were to be confined to their barracks. On that day, there was not a uniformed member of the national police to be seen in the whole province of Palermo. The multitude outside the wall of Prince Allorto's estate waited. The 6 mafia chiefs rode their horses up and down as consistent as metronomes, their faces impassive, their guns sheathed in rifle holsters, lupare on shoulder straps, pistols tucked in their belts hidden by jackets. They made no menacing signs toward the crowd. Indeed, they ignored them. They simply rode in silence back and forth. The peasants, as if hoping the horses would tire and carry these guardian dragons away, opened their food sacks and uncorked their wine bottles. They were mostly men, only a few women, and among these was the girl Justina with her mother and father. They had come to show their defiance for the murderers of Silvia Ferra, and yet none of them dared pass the line of slowly moving horses, dared to claim the land that was theirs by right of law. It was not only fear that restrained them. These riders were men of respect, who were in fact the lawgivers of the towns they lived in. The Friends of the Friends had established their own shadowy government that functioned more effectively than the government in Rome. Was there a thief or cattle rustler stealing a peasant's cattle and sheep? If the victim reported the crime to the carabinieri, he would never recover his goods. But if he went to see the mafia chiefs and paid a 20% fee, the lost stock would be found and he would receive a guarantee that it would not happen again. If a hot-tempered bully murdered some innocent workman over a glass of wine, the government could rarely convict because of perjured testimony and the law of omerta. But if the victim's family went to one of these 6 men of respect, then vengeance and justice could be had. Chronic petty thieves in poor neighborhoods would be executed, feuds settled with honor, a quarrel over land boundaries resolved without the expense of lawyers. These 6 men were judges whose opinions could not be appealed or ignored, whose punishments were severe and could not be evaded except by emigration. These 6 men had power in Sicily that not even the premier of Italy could exercise, and so the crowd remained outside Prince Allorto's walls. The 6 mafia chiefs did not ride close together. That would have been a sign of weakness. They rode separately, like independent kings, each carrying his own particular brand of terror. The most feared, riding a mottled gray horse, was Don Ciano from the town of Basacchino. He was now over 60 years of age, and his face was as gray and as mottled as the hide of his horse. He had become a legend at the age of 26 when he had assassinated the mafia chief preceding him. The man had murdered Don Ciano's father when the Don himself had been a child of 12, and Ciano had waited 14 years for his revenge. Then one day he had dropped from a tree onto the victim and his horse, and, clasping the man from behind, had forced him to ride through the main street of the town. As they rode in front of the people, Ciano had slashed his victim to pieces, cutting off his nose, his lips, his ears, and his genitals, and then holding the bloody corpse in his arms had paraded the horse in front of the victim's house. Afterward he had ruled his province with a bloody and ironed hand. The second mafia chief, riding a black horse with scarlet plumes over its ears, was Don Arzana of the town of Piani dei Greci. He was a calm, deliberate man who believed that there was always two sides in a quarrel and had refused to kill Silvia Fera for political purposes, had indeed forestalled the man's fate for years. He was distressed by Fera's murder, but had been powerless to intervene, since Don Croce and the other mafia chiefs insisted that the time had come to make an example in his area. His rule had been tempered with mercy and kindness, and he was the most loved of the 6 tyrants. But now, as he rode his horse in front of the assembled multitude, his face was stern, all his inner doubts erased. The third man on horseback was Don Pidu of Caltanissetta, and his steed's bridle was garlanded with flowers. He was known to be susceptible to flattery and vain of his appearance, jealous of power and murderous to the aspirations of young men. At a village festival, a young peasant gallant had stricken the local women dumb with admiration because he wore bells on his ankles when he danced, wore a shirt and trousers made of green silk, tailored in Palermo, and sang as he played a guitar manufactured in Madrid. Don Pidu had been incensed with the adulation shown this rural Valentino, furious that the women did not admire a real man like himself rather than this simpering, effeminate youth, who danced no more after that fateful day but was found on the road to his farm, his body riddled with bullets. The fourth mafia chief was Don Marcuzzi of the town of Villamura, who was known to be an ascetic, and he had his own chapel in his home like the old nobility. Don Marcuzzi, despite this one affectation, lived very simply, and was personally a poor man since he refused to profit by his power. But he enjoyed that power enormously. He was tireless in his endeavors to help his fellow Sicilians, but he was also a true believer in the old ways of the friends of the friends. He had become a legend when he executed his favorite nephew for committing an infamita, the breaking of the law of omerta, giving information to the police against a rival mafia faction. The fifth man on horseback was Don Bucilla of Partenico, who had come to see Hector Adonis in behalf of his nephew on the long ago fateful day when Torre Giuliano became an outlaw. Now, 5 years later, he was heavier by 40 pounds. He still wore his opera peasant clothes despite the fact that he had become enormously wealthy in those 5 years. His ferocity was benign, but he could not abide dishonesty and executed thieves with the same righteousness as those 18th century English high justices proclaiming the death penalty on child pickpockets. The sixth man was Guido Quintana, who, though nominally of Montelepre, had made his reputation by taking over the bloody battleground of the town of Corleone. He had been forced to do this because Montelepre was directly under the protection of Giuliano. But in Corleone, Guido Quintana had found what his murderous heart yearned for. He had settled 4 family feuds by the simple expedient of wiping out opponents to his decisions. He had murdered Silvia Fera and the other union organizers. He was perhaps the only mafia chief who was hated more than he was respected. These were the 6 men who, by their reputations and the respect of enormous amount of fear they could generate, barred the lands of Prince Olorto to the poor peasants of Sicily. 2 jeeps full of armed men sped down the Montelepre-Palermo road and turned off on the path that led to the estate wall. All but 2 of the men were masked with wool coverings that had slits cut open over their eyes. The 2 unmasked men were Turi Giuliano and Aspano Pisciotta. The masked men included Corporal Canio Silvestro, Passatempo, and Terranova. Andolini, also masked, covered the road from Palermo. As the jeeps pulled up about 50 feet from the mafia horsemen, additional men pushed through the crowd of peasants. They too were masked. They had been picnicking in the grove of olive trees. When the 2 jeeps appeared, they had opened food baskets and taken out their weapons and their masks. They spread out into a long half circle and covered the horsemen with their rifles. All told, there were about 50 of them. Turi Giuliano jumped out of his jeep and checked to see that everyone was in place. He watched the 6 riders going back and forth. He knew they had seen him, and he knew the crowd, too, had recognized him. The smoky Sicilian afternoon sun tinged the green landscape with red. Giuliano wondered how these thousands of tough peasants could be so intimidated that they let 6 men keep the bread out of the mouths of their children. Aspano Pisciotta was waiting like an impatient viper beside him. Only Aspano had refused to wear a mask. All the others had feared a vendetta from the families of the 6 mafia chiefs and from the friends of the friends. Now Giuliano and Pisciotta would bear the brunt of the vendetta. They both wore the gold buckles engraved with the lion and the eagle. Giuliano had only a heavy pistol in his holster hanging from his belt. He also wore the emerald ring he had taken from the Duchess years ago. Pisciotta carried a machine pistol cradled in his arms. His face was pale from his lung disease and excitement. He was impatient with Giuliano for taking so long. But Giuliano was carefully watching the scene to make sure his orders had been carried out. His men had formed the half circle to leave an escape route for the mafia chiefs should they decide to ride away. If they ran, they would lose respect and a great deal of their influence. The peasants would no longer fear them. But he saw Don Ciano turn his mottled gray horse and the others following him to parade again before the wall. They would not run. From one of the towers of his ancient palace, Prince Olorto watched the scene through the telescope he used to chart the stars. He could see Turi Giuliano's face clearly and in detail, the oval eyes, the clean planes of his face, the generous mouth now pressed tight, and he knew that the strength in his face was the strength of virtue, and thought it was a pity that virtue was not a more merciful asset. For it was terrible indeed when it was pure, as the prince knew this to be pure. He was ashamed of his own role. He knew his fellow Sicilians so well, and now he would be responsible for what was about to happen. The 6 great men he had bound with money would fight for him. They would not run. They had intimidated the great multitude who were before his wall. But now Giuliano was standing before them like an avenging angel. Already it seemed to the prince that the sun was darkening. Giuliano strode to the path the 6 men rode. They were squat heavy men on horseback, and they kept their mounts to a slow, steady walk. From time to time they would feed their horses off a huge pile of oats heaped against the jagged white stone wall. This was so the horses would defecate continuously and leave a constant insulting trail of manure. Then they would continue their slow ride. Turi Giuliano placed himself very close to their path, Pisciotta a step behind him. The 6 men on horseback did not look his way or stop. Their faces were inscrutable. Though they all wore lupare over their shoulders, they did not attempt to unsling them. Giuliano waited. The men rode past him 3 more times. Giuliano stepped back. He said quietly to Pisciotta, "Bring them down from their horses and present them to me." Then he crossed the path and leaned against the white stone wall of the estate. Leaning against the wall, he knew that he had crossed a fatal line, that what he was doing this day would decide his fate. But he felt no hesitation, no uneasiness, only a cold rage against the world. He knew that behind these 6 men loomed the enormous figure of Don Croce, and that it was the Don who was his final enemy. And he felt anger against this very multitude of people he was helping. Why were they so docile, so fearful? If only he could arm and lead them, he could forge a new Sicily. But then he felt a wave of pity for these poorly clad, nearly starved peasants, and he raised his arm in a salute to encourage them. The crowd remained silent. For a moment he thought of Silvio Ferra, who might have roused them. Now Pesciota took command of the stage. He was wearing his cream-colored sweater with the dragons rampant woven darkly in the woolen material. His sleek dark head, narrow with his knife edge, was etched in the blood-red Sicilian sunlight. He turned that head like a blade toward the 6 obelisks riding their horses and watched them for a long moment with his deadly viper's gaze. Don Ciano's mount defecated at his feet as the 6 men rode past. Pesciota stepped back 1 pace. He nodded toward Terranova, past the temple and Silvestro, who ran to the 50 armed masked men forming the covering arc. The men spread out further to close off the escape route that had been left open. The mafia chiefs continued riding proudly as if they noticed nothing, though they had of course observed and understood everything. But they had won the first round of their battle. Now it was for Giuliano to decide whether to take the last and most dangerous step. Pesciota moved into the path of Don Ciano's horse and raised his hand imperiously to that grave, fearful face. But Don Ciano did not stop. When the horse tried to shy away, the rider pulled his head tight, and they would have ridden over Pesciota had he not stepped aside and, with a savage grin, bowed low to the Don as he passed by. Then Pesciota stepped directly behind the horse and rider, sighted his machine pistol on his gray hindquarters of the horse, and pulled the trigger. The fragrant flowered air was filled with ropey entrails, a vast shower of blood, and 1,000 golden flecks of manure. The hail of bullets swept the horse's legs beneath him, and he fell straight down. Don Ciano's body was trapped by the fallen body until 4 of Giuliano's men pulled him out and bound his arms behind his back. The horse was still alive, and Pesciota stepped forward and mercifully pulled a spray of bullets into the animal's head. A low moan of terror and exultation rose from the crowd. Giuliano remained leaning against the wall, his heavy pistol still in its holster. He stood in his arms as if he, too, were wondering what Aspano Pesciota would do next. The remaining 5 chiefs continued their parade. Their mounts had reared up at the sound of gunfire, but the riders quickly brought them under control. They rode as slowly as before. Again Pesciota stepped onto the path. Again he raised his hand. The lead rider, Don Bucilla, stopped. The others behind him reined their horses still. Pesciota called to them, "Your families will need your horses in the days to come. I promised to send them. Now dismount and pay your respects to Giuliano." His voice rang loud and clear to the ears of the multitude. There was a long silence, and then the 5 men dismounted. They stood there proudly gazing at the crowd, their eyes fierce and insolent. The long arc of Giuliano's men broke as 20 of them came close, guns ready. Carefully and gently they bound the arms of the 5 men behind their backs. Then they led all 6 chiefs to Giuliano. Giuliano regarded the 6 men without expression. Quintana had humiliated him once, had even tried to assassinate him, but now the situation was reversed. Quintana's face had not changed over these 5 years. It had the same wolfish look, but at this moment the eyes seemed vacant and wandering behind the mafioso mask of defiance. Don Ciano stared at Giuliano with contempt on his grey face. Bucilla seemed a little astonished, as if he were surprised by so much ill feeling in an affair that did not really concern him. The other dons looked him coldly in the eye, as ultimate men of respect must do. Giuliano knew them all by reputation. As a child he had feared some of these men, especially Don Ciano. Now he had humiliated them before all Sicily, and they would never forgive him. They would be deadly enemies forever. He knew what he must do, but he knew also that they were beloved husbands and fathers, that their children would weep for them. They gazed past him proudly, giving no signs of fear. Their message was clear. Let Giuliano what he had to do if he had the belly for it. Don Ciano spat at Giuliano's feet. Giuliano looked at them in the face, each separately. "Kneel and make your peace with God," he said. None of the men moved. Giuliano turned and walked away from them. The 6 mafia chiefs stood outlined against the white stone wall. Giuliano reached his line of men, then turned. He said in a loud, clear voice that could be heard by the crowd, "I execute you in the name of God and Sicily," then touched Pisciotta on the shoulder. At that moment Don Marcucci started to kneel, but Pisciotta had already opened fire. Passatempo and Terranova and the corporal, still masked, also fired. The 6 bound bodies were flung up against the wall by the storm of machine-gun bullets. The jagged white stones were splattered with red-purple gouts of blood and pellets of flesh torn from their galvanized bodies. They seemed to be dancing from strings as they were flung back again and again by the continuing hail of bullets. High in the tower of his palace, Prince Alorto turned away from the telescope, so he did not see what happened next. Giuliano stepped forward and advanced to the wall. He drew the heavy pistol from his belt and slowly and ceremoniously shot each of the fallen mafia chiefs through the head. There was a great hoarse roar from that watching crowd, and, in seconds, thousands were streaming through the gates of Prince Alorto's estate. Giuliano watched them. He noticed that none of the crowd came near him.